Welcome to another episode of Lightbulb Moments. Here we are, just having the official start to summer, and I'm glad you're with us today. So whether you're joining us through listening on the podcast or viewing the YouTube or joining us live, thanks for spending some of your precious attention and time with us. I am Tom Kuhn. I'm your host and curator of Lightbulb Moments. Shout out to one of our sponsors, Lightheart Sanders, who's been a legacy sponsor of this forum for some time now. And today we have a guest, which I'll get to in a moment, but I'm also trying to think of some news in the community. Certainly, we're getting close to the mid-year mark. And as we look at the mid-year mark, it's a great time to take a fresh look at what is going to happen in the second half of the year for you. As it relates to all the different functions of your business, whether it's finance, education, human capital, and whatever. So whatever your plans are for the second half of the year, again, this is a great time to regroup. We're soon entering what we call season number 5 at Cunity. Our 8 seasons approach is a more digestible way to look at the year. So that's all I got for you in terms of where we're at in the year. I want to get to our guest here. And Larry, I can see you're already on camera. And let me make an introduction. So Dr. Larry Schooler is assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin. He's a mediator, facilitator, and a communications consultant. Dr. Schuler has spent his career helping organizations navigate their toughest challenges, from difficult conversations to building collaborative teams. His work across private, public, and nonprofit sectors has equipped him with real-world insights into what transforms conflict into connection and chaos into clarity. Interestingly enough, he's got some unique experience even as it relates to teaching conflict resolution in prison. Maybe we'll get to that in our conversation today. If you're at the Phil in May, you experienced firsthand how Dr. Schooler captivated the room with his interactive approach to team dynamics and meaningful communication. Now we're bringing his expertise to Lightbulb Moments for a conversation that goes beyond theory into the practical wisdom salon and wellness professionals can apply immediately. Good morning, Larry. How are you?
I'm great, Tom. It's wonderful to be with you this morning. Thank you.
That's one big longhorn behind.
He is quite docile and tame. I've worked with him on his conflict management skills, and I think he's mastered most of them.
Very good. Well, it's great to be able to spend time with you again here. And in terms of some of the areas we're going to get into today is areas that within your expertise. And we'll start really with the concept of a difficult conversation, which is something that all of us can relate with, whether it's in a professional realm, which is really the format of our forum is the world of professional, but also personal. And certainly conflicts can weigh you down. They can emotionally drain you. Oftentimes the fear of the conversation is a lot worse than the actual conversation. But as someone that really specializes and actually teaches courses on difficult conversations, why don't you, I've set the stage for you, so let's unpack that first, okay?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me. And I think, no industry, no part of our world is immune from difficult conversations or from conflict. I always start my courses at UT Austin by just saying conflict is, period, full stop. It's the sun rising in the east, as steady as that. And for me, when I think about a difficult conversation, I think of it in a few different ways. One, of course, can be the subject matter. What are we discussing that is hard to talk about? It could be a person being let go. It could be a lack of high performance. It could be just something that is unpleasant to talk about generally, having nothing to do with the workplace. It also could be difficult because of the person with whom you're talking. I certainly have people in my life that I think of as not difficult people, because I think that's a little bit of a misnomer, but people with whom I find it difficult to get into something more sensitive for how they will react and what that reaction will feel like to me. And then I think something else that makes it difficult that we sometimes underestimate is the effect that external pressures can have on the conversation. So when we feel a certain amount of time pressure, or when we feel as if others are bearing down on us to have a conversation, that can, I think, contribute heavily to making a conversation more difficult because it feels like lots is at stake, and there's a lot riding on the conversation, and I don't think any of us really relish that. I do sometimes do my best work on a tight deadline, but when it comes to a difficult conversation, I really long for the benefit of being able to consider what I'm going to say and do, and take some time to prepare rather than being up against it. So I think when we look at what makes conversations difficult, we have to think about some of those externalities, some of those time pressures and people pressures. We have to look at who we're speaking with, and we also have to think about the topic of that conversation. And we can get into kind of what can make each of those seem a little less difficult.
Yeah, let's continue with that.
Well, I think from the standpoint of the subject matter, one of the things that I have adopted in both my personal and professional life is sort of the affirmation practice, of saying something aloud, like I can do this, I get to do this, the world won't end if such and such happens, and I think that's very relevant to entering a difficult conversation, to recognize that, you know, we're in a unique position, whether it's because we have freedom of speech in the US and we're allowed to say things without, fear of massive retribution, or whether it's that we're in a hiring or managerial role and we have that privilege, or just that we have the opportunity to communicate with someone who we've had some meaningful connection with. So as much as we may be dreading that difficult conversation, I think it's important to remind ourselves that we are capable of having the conversation, and that it's something of a gift to be able to, and that we will get through it, even if what it looks like to have gotten through it is a little bit up to chance, or a little bit up to stuff that we can't fully predict. So I think that's one piece of it. I think when it comes to the person who might seem like they're going to cause some difficulty, there are a few options that we can pursue. One of which is to have a third person involved in the conversation. And that can be a person external to our organization, or it can be a person within the organization that we both trust. And I've certainly had the privilege of being that third party sometimes in sitting down with parties in conflict. But I think that in a lot of circumstances, it's okay to involve someone who can help to reduce the temperature, or help to reframe some of the spicier ways in which we're communicating, in order to just help our points get across more clearly and with less defensiveness. And so I encourage folks, when they feel as if the person with whom they're speaking uh, might not react in the ways that they'd like, to consider who that third party could be, that could be helpful. But I also think when it comes to a person you're not sure how they will react, uh, there's that sort of now somewhat platitudinal, cliched kind of idea of a sandwich, where the bread of the sandwich uh, is the stuff that you're sort of pleased about in terms of the person. So if you're talking to someone in a way that requires some critical feedback, you can lead with, I really like how such and such is going, or you're really handling, A, B, and C well, and I want to talk to you a minute about D, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that A, B, and C are working out really well. And it doesn't have to be false flattery, or just sort of puffing somebody up. It can be sort of genuine, meaningful feedback that they may just benefit from having, regardless of what's to come later in the conversation. So I think that's really important. And then getting back to the externalities, I think, if your teammate is not used to sitting down with you one on one, then I think it can be very jarring if you say, "Hey, come see me in my office." And so we need to contemplate the timing of that conversation, the setting, the context, because there are different ways in which those requests for a conversation can land with the person and sort of put them on edge. So fitting within whatever kind of works with that relationship, I think is also very important. So long answer, but I think those are some of the things that I take into account as I'm either preparing for a difficult conversation myself or helping someone else prepare for one.
Well, a few things that come to mind to me is that really you're stressing being very intentional about the conversation. And being intentional around it means thinking about it in advance, and preparation as opposed to just launching into the topic, because the stakes can be very high in a difficult conversation. I mean, stakes so high they could ultimately even result in legal ramifications in the case of a difficult conversation, letting someone go.
Right.
So I'm hearing intentionality a lot to what you're saying. um, I love I get to have the conversation. The sandwich principle that was taught to me a long time ago. Um, people have cynicism around the sandwich, type. It seems almost too formulaic. However, in the same vein, it works. I mean, it's so. Um, so I'm gonna ask you something related to this whole process, and it has to do with the topic of triangulation. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to take us off track a little bit, but it still relates to difficult conversation. To me, a lot of times a issue might happen just due to two individuals talking to each other, and then have another individual involved. So you have these triangular conversations without all three people being present at the same time. Is triangulation, first of all, is that the right word for it? And how would you address that topic?
Mm. Well, I like triangulation as a term. I'm not going to change it. I think it works very well, and we have to be mindful of how potentially avoiding the difficult conversation can directly result in that kind of triangulation, which can, in and of itself, inspire resentment. So, in other words, if you and I have something we need to work out, and instead I go to Genteni to talk about it, for example, you may get wind of that somehow, and then be upset with me just for having done that. So, even if you don't have any idea what I said to Genteni or why I did that or what have you, there can be some concern or your wire is up because of the fact that I didn't come to you directly. And there are a lot of people who take exception to that. There are cultures, I should say, though, where that's not always preferred, that direct confrontation, and it's important to recognize that some people will come from backgrounds in which it's very uncomfortable or even um, frowned upon to do that. So we need to be cognizant of that. But I think that triangulation runs the risk of essentially a very sophisticated game of telephone, where whatever I say to that third person gets garbled and then comes to you as something extra spicy. My family doesn't like to eat spicy food, and then you're now faced with not just the difficult conversation you thought you needed to have to begin with, but unwinding and unpacking some of these other, mixed messages that weren't what you intended, but got garbled and got kind of staticky because of that third point on the triangle. So that's not a case for avoiding the involvement of the third party, but I think there needs to be some transparency around that. It's okay, of course, to ask for some advice from someone and stress that it's confidential and really make sure it's someone you can trust. And it's also okay to see if that person would be willing to sit down with the two of you. But I think if you're just sort of venting and you don't know whether that person will keep your conversation to themselves, you're just setting yourself up for yet another layer of difficulty, I think, in those difficult conversations. So whether it should be called triangulation or not, I think it's an apt term and can really sharpen the conversation in not the most positive of ways if we're not careful.
I want to move the conversation over to something that's referred to as facilitated leadership, of which you give due credit to another party, which we'll get to in a moment. But I want to pause here for a little bit because and almost take a little bit of a step back here. We talked about difficult conversations, but I also want to really get to your whole background here. So you have a PhD in conflict resolution. And that's a very rare PhD. Is that correct?
Well, there aren't too many programs for it, for sure. Probably because the, there aren't too many people that want to lean into some of that sort of work. So in the U.S., there really are very, very few doctoral programs in that space. I was fortunate to be able to complete one at Nova Southeastern University a few years back.
And how did you happen to get into that area of specialty? What drew you to that area as a professional interest?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking. I'll try to make it a brief answer, but it goes all the way back about 20, almost 25 years now. I was a reporter in my first life, worked for public radio, National Public Radio, and I was covering a story in North Carolina in which a group of citizens wanted to revisit a terrible tragedy that took place in the Greensboro community. And they wanted to do it through a mechanism known as truth and reconciliation. And if you've ever heard that phrase, you've probably heard it in conjunction with how South Africa handled things after Nelson Mandela came to power and apartheid came to an end. And they wanted to address that conflict in a way that was less focused on retribution and more focused on restoration. So less about punishing wrongdoers and more about folks taking accountability and contributing to the repair and the restoration of a healthy country. And so I was so intrigued by this concept in North Carolina that I mean it has spawned a book, that I'm hoping to have come out in the next several months and a variety of other things. But it really planted the seed within me that there is this field that you can be a part of that doesn't require you to, file a lawsuit or prosecute someone or as I say, be fixated on the act of punishing someone or taking revenge or trying to get back at somebody. And so that sort of set me on a course in which after I left journalism, I took on a role within municipal government down here in Austin, where every week my entire job was facilitating conversations among people interested in what the city of Austin was up to and trying to help find consensus that then the city council could adapt as policy direction. And so that's kind of the way that getting a degree in this space and the career I have now started to develop. Happy to go into more detail, but that's the
And
that's the seed of it.
and government agencies bring you in. I mean, they bring you in and like conflict, unpack that for just a minute.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I'm fortunate to say that I've been brought in a lot of different scenarios that it really doesn't just line up with one type of issue or one type of conflict. I think where I have certainly found the most fulfillment is when, a city council, or it could be a nonprofit board of directors, it could be a state legislature, state agency, federal agency, but when a city council or a city government says, we've got this pretty big issue. For example, we have a very overcrowded animal shelter and we need a new strategic plan to figure out how we're going to deal with this ongoing challenge. Or I've had the privilege of working in circumstances born by tragedy where we've had a terrible mass shooting, and we need to build a memorial and get some consensus on what that should look like. I've worked in Orlando on the Pulse Memorial, Virginia Beach on the 531 Memorial, or we need to address housing affordability and the constant difficulty of folks being able to afford a home in our community, and we need a task force for that. So it can range from something as singular as like an officer involved shooting, in a community that causes sows seeds of distrust. It could be a neighbor complaint associated with, music being played at a nearby restaurant and so on. Or it can get very sophisticated and deal with things that have the potential to have very long lasting impact and really affect a lot of people. So I think I really benefit from circumstances in which I can help create a table metaphorically and literally that brings all of the key stakeholders around it to really wrestle with the different ways that this issue can be resolved that would benefit the collective, not just one or two people.
These are high stake topics here. And so you're really the voice of reason in the room in many cases.
Not in my personal life always, but sometimes I can get very animated, especially if it's the referee at one of my son's games.
Mhm.
But when it comes to this kind of work, I really think that I'm blessed to have worked in journalism before this because obviously, I think one of the more fundamental tenets of good journalism is often, remaining objective, even in circumstances where you have a personal point of view. And, I was challenged often by stories that were, ones that I felt a certain way about, but I also had to maintain my objectivity so that people would hear my story as authentic. And so I think that that's served me well in this role because I'm always looking for ways to understand points of view that I don't understand. Uh, and I'm human. I'm not an unbiased person. I want people to understand that there is no such thing as an unbiased person. We all have biases. I'm just challenged to mute mine in different ways and suppress mine in different ways. But when I hear something with which I may completely disagree, I've trained myself in the instinct of, I'd never thought about that. Tell me more about that, as opposed to, you don't know what you're talking about. That's ridiculous.
And then you also teach, and so you teach, um, and tell us about your the classes that you teach.
Well, sometimes I wonder whether I shouldn't just have started teaching when I was young because of my last name, Tom. I mean, what where else should a man named Schooler go?
Right.
But Here in about the last decade or so, I've been lucky enough to teach in higher ed, and for the last 6 years at University of Texas at Austin. And the courses that I teach really are connected by the thread of, how do we as leaders and as people communicate, uh, especially when the stakes are high and the tensions might be high, and it's really important that we get to an outcome that folks can live with and accept. So my conflict resolution course, of course, is a sort of survey type course that looks at why conflict happens and why it escalates and what we can do to resolve it. You referenced the facilitative leadership course before, and I want to credit David Conley and Paul Goldman as two of the forerunners of that phrase, of that concept. But it's this idea that rather than just the leader having her or his vision and then imparting it to followers and expecting them to do as she or he or they say, it's designed such that you involve your followers, your stakeholders in decisions. And so in that course, we look at the paradigm of facilitative leadership, but we also learn how to facilitate, how to have a meaningful conversation with a group of people around an objective and with some discussion agreements, and a very clear agenda that helps people have a say in decisions that matter that are going to affect them. So I've built some other courses, but those really are the crux of what I've been able to teach at UT Austin.
Let's stay with this whole idea of facilitated leadership a little bit longer. And I'm mindful of who our audience is today, both live and who will listen to this, and they are essentially leaders in the beauty and wellness space. That conflict comes all the time with staff, with clients, with leadership teams, et cetera. And change management is something that I believe is a very important skill for leaders. And I think especially moving into the era of AI, change management is going to become a more important attribute for leaders. So the idea behind facilitated leadership, as I understand from you, has to do with getting input from people, genuine input from people before actually, for example, making a change. Is that
That's
it? Is
right.
that it? Yep.
Yeah, no, that's a very good way of putting it. And I think sometimes some of the more forward-thinking facilitative leaders go beyond the box in terms of who they ask. So you were referencing, folks in the industry. I may sound naive, but in certain circumstances, I would even want my clients or my customers to have some say because, of course, they're going to be impacted by a decision in most instances, and that may cause them to, double down on their loyalty or leave the business entirely. And so there are reasonable, time and cost efficient ways to involve even the client or the customer in some of those conversations, much less the staff, the leadership team, other key folks whose voice needs to be a part of the dialogue.
I'm just thinking of a few examples that some of our listeners might deal with. And where they might be on the fence to get some input, for example, from team members. Start with team members first. We'll leave clients out for just for a moment, even though
Sure.
certainly see the value of that. So a few examples are a compensation change. Company's going to make a compensation change, and it's going to affect members of the team, as opposed to just here it is. It's getting feedback. That'd be one. And number two would be was dealing with an owner recently, and a local salon closed, and a bunch of staff wanted to come work at his salon, and his leadership team didn't necessarily embrace it. And another final example I'll throw out to you, this is just off the top of my head, is let's say you've got a profit related strategy. For example, a lot of our clients these days are considering whether they pass through a credit card charge to their client or not. And that, of course, affects clients, but also affects team members. So those are just three things off the top of my head that require change,
Hmm.
where facilitated or getting feedback may or may not be a good idea. I would lean more towards it would be a good idea.
Yeah.
So lobby back on that one.
Yeah, I think the compensation one is very interesting. They're all interesting, but the compensation one is very interesting because I'm sure that there are a lot of business owners or leaders of businesses who are reluctant to show too much information as it relates to the finances. From my perspective, I think that as long as that's kept within the organization, I understand that these are mostly, private companies who don't want their stuff aired out. But I think that if the leadership can share in a transparent way with the team, here are our circumstances financially, here's what we are weighing, and do that at a point in time that's early enough for them to digest it, understand it, and then provide feedback that could be relevant to a compensation conversation. It takes courage, and I'm not suggesting it would be um, easy or risk free to do something like that. But we are seeing in the municipal government space a lot of innovation around the budgeting conversations with their communities, even so far as some cities allocating a certain amount of money for the public to decide how to spend and literally vote on that and spend it. So it's a level of transparency that, on the one hand might seem more appropriate for the public sector, but that's a step well beyond, I think, where we've been. And so there could be something in there for a private business owner where she or he or they can say, look, I'd like your input, your advice. I'm considering some changes based on these variables. And I think for facilitative leadership, you can't really execute it without the transparency and the information. You can't just say, I'm thinking about a compensation change. What do you think? You need folks to understand the context for why that conversation is happening and what some of the variables are to consider. So that of the scenarios you talked about, that certainly, resonates in terms of a possible way for folks to deal with it. The one you referenced where the salon's closing and maybe to bring folks over, to me, I think that speaks to a need for a business to have a conversation about what are our mission, vision, and values. And it doesn't have to be, a months long strategic planning process or what have you. It can be a short, retreat or an extended staff meeting where some of that gets talked about. But the benefit to that can be that we all understand collectively what we're here to do and how we're here to do it. And then when we have someone potentially coming in from an outside source, whether it be a closing salon or just an applicant from outside, we can determine whether they align with what we've set up for ourselves to do. I think a lot of companies may have those kinds of things in the back of their heads, but not articulate them as explicitly. But I've seen plenty who put it on walls and on posters and on their websites and are very explicit with it. And so I think that makes it a little bit easier instead of just saying, oh, we don't want more stylists because of what it'll do to our compensation or clientele, or oh, those folks at that other salon felt something very different, or whatever knee jerk kind of reactions there might be. We can say, okay, we're about these things. Are these other folks about these things? And is there a match there? Is there alignment that we can agree on collectively, or is there not?
I just thought I'm smiling because I just thought of another example. And the reason why I'm smiling is because literally in an hour and a half, I'm on with a client and I want to share with you, and maybe you'll help me prepare. I feel prepared for this, but so let me give you the scenario. And this is a difficult conversation. And it's a difficult conversation, not necessarily in a bad way, but let me lay it out for you, okay? And I
Okay.
want to get your input. And so this is for selfish reasons, but I think our listeners might appreciate this. So we have a particular client that we're working with on succession planning, which within our coaching and advisory work, it is a specialty. And at noon today, we are going to meet with the owners and help them plan a group conversation about their desire to eventually retire. And to see if any members of the staff have an interest in being an entrepreneur and actually have an interest in becoming the or a future owner in this organization. And so it's a very delicate conversation. It's in front of the entire team. You have members of the leadership team sitting in the room, of which the one or two main key leaders don't really feel like it's in their wheelhouse to be the future owner.
Mhm.
So here, the words need to be chosen very carefully. And there's a level of transparency, but also there's a level of fear because who knows, the staff could interpret it to be, whoa, they're going to retire. I didn't sign up for this. Or so anyway, I'm just curious to see any thoughts you have about a conversation like that.
Well, it's a great example, and I hope that I don't cause you to have to scramble before this before this meeting by what I'm going to suggest. I for one would wonder whether, well, first of all, I would want to clarify what their objectives are for the meeting. Are they truly trying to have the meeting in order to identify a potential successor? And my
Yes.
position on that would be that that's going to be a very hard thing to accomplish because you're going to have potentially very worthy candidates for succession who will not tip their hand, who will not feel comfortable doing so, or will think it's in their strategic best interest not to do so. And then you'll also have folks who, may step forward, but you have your reservations about them, and so then you're in a position of, having to dampen some enthusiasm, perhaps for being part of it. So I think a few things could make that meeting a little bit more productive or more useful. One of which is to have a bilateral conversation about what are some of the qualities and experience that this successor or successors should or need to and have that collective conversation with the team. So you're not talking about whether Tom specifically should be the next person. You're talking about what are the ways in which that person needs to show up as a leader in order to successfully bring our business forward. And I think it might be useful to at least clarify the way this decision will be made, if not decide as a group how the decision will be made. And let it not go unsaid, Tom, there are times, even in a facilitative leadership model, where that leader is getting input, but still retaining the power to make the final decision individually. This is not a complete, ceding of power in ancient Athens, where everything gets decided by popular vote. Um, but I think that when you get the group together, they're going to wonder, well, on what basis are you making this decision and who actually gets to make this decision? And are we going to take a vote? And how does this work? And so you could make a discussion happen around just how we want this decision to be made. Or you could at least be transparent and say, ultimately, what we envision is, we get input from folks on what the person should be like. We get folks to step forward as candidates, and then this is how we'll evaluate them and make a decision. But if it were me, I would really want people to speak to the general kinds of qualities and assets that they would want that successor to bring, before I would have it be sort of an open call for who's interested, and then have a process in place to determine who that successor is that aligns with the group's shared vision for what they should be like.
Yeah, good stuff. Thanks for that. Very helpful. Appreciate it.
Sure.
This is good stuff, Larry. Let's start closing things out here and staying with facilitated leadership just a little bit longer, because I know it's a topic that you've got a lot of expertise. Anything else that you want our listeners to keep in mind as it relates to facilitated leadership or tricks of the trade?
For sure. I mean, I think first of all, planning is hugely important. I asked you for the objective of the meeting that we were just talking about in terms of succession planning. It's crucial for a facilitative leader anytime they're going to get their group together, whatever group that is, to be able to articulate very clearly an objective for why we're having this meeting, especially in an age where people are quick to say, oh, this could have been an email, as we've often heard. Why do we need to get together in the same time and space and talk? What are we trying to achieve here? And make sure it's a manageable objective. Don't say in 2 hours we're going to, I don't know, completely change our business model or something that's unrealistic. Make it a very reasonable objective to achieve in whatever time you've set aside. I think discussion agreements are very important, and I choose that language instead of ground rules because to me, ground rules sound like grade school or something with a very different, kind of dynamic than a group of adults having a conversation. So I usually will bring a set of discussion agreements that I've borrowed from other sources and ask for folks to either agree to those or suggest other ones that they think are more germane. Um, I also think it's important to say that there are times when it's really helpful to bring a facilitator in from outside the organization who doesn't have a stake in whatever it is that you're discussing. And I'm not saying that to promote myself. I'm saying that because, that happens all the time. And some of those folks are embedded in the organization, but they're in kind of a special unit, like an organizational development unit or human resources or something. But those are very handy people to have because they're there to be that calmer voice of reason, as you put it, or to just be objective across multiple divisions or parts of the company. But occasionally having someone from the outside who has no vested interest whatsoever in what the group decides is helpful because it lets the leader participate. She or he or they can express their point of view in a way that I think is helpful for the group to hear. And the last thing I'll say is that if the facilitative leader is actually leading the meeting, which is perfectly acceptable, they do, I think, for this to be effective, need to try to suppress a little bit of their own perspective because the less of it they share, the more they'll hear from their team members in ways that are meaningful and helpful. The more that they share, now I'm suddenly like, ooh, if I disagree with that, I'm not going to be well received, so I better not speak up. So it's a hard thing for a leader to do. They often are installed based on a number of different qualities and talents, including, charisma or just powerful communication. So I'm not trying to make a leader, disappear. But I also think that in these kinds of settings, the more you can listen, the more you can invite others to share their views, and the less of your views that you share up front, the better the conversation will be. So I hope those are some helpful things.
Larry, thanks for being a great guest today. Let's give Larry a virtual round of applause. So appreciate you being part of the Phil and taking your precious time to join us today and your talents. You should be receiving very soon $1 million light bulb
Wow.
for being a guest on Lightbulb Moments. Check your mailbox
All right.
and keep up the good work, and let's stay in touch, Larry.
Absolutely, Tom. And thanks to everybody who either is listening on the podcast or listening today. It's been great to be with you all and keep up the good work as well.
All right. Thanks again.
You're welcome.
All right, everybody. We'll see you in a couple weeks with another episode of Lightbulb Moments. Again, a big shout out and thank you to Dr. Schooler today. And as Louisa said, he was great at the Phil. Thank you for that comment, Louisa. And next time I'll be seeing all of you will be in the month of July. So we'll see you in a couple weeks. And thanks for joining us. Bye now.